Let's get joined up. Today's show is brought to you by Audible, and right now you can get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/joined up. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. So thanks for tuning in to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, a regular show about all things writing, including interviews with authors, screenwriters, and key figures from the publishing industry. Plus loads of hints, tips, and inspiration for all creatives. You can follow us on Twitter at JU Podcast, leave a quick iTunes review, or just tell a friend. Right, cue that new theme tune. Hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, where a little procrastination can go a long way. I'm Wayne Kelly, and it's episode 126 with Laura Zigman, author of new tragi-comic novel Separation Anxiety. Laura's funny, warm and insightful, with a career that's included a hit debut novel, a Hugh Jackman film, personal tragedy and ghostwriting before she made an inspiring return to her own work. It was really fun to chat to Laura, and it was a perfect tonic for these strange and uncertain times. Speaking of which, how are you all doing? How are you coping? Are you managing to stay fit, healthy and sane? I'm still yet to return fully to novel writing and still find myself distracted and unable to concentrate on anything for very long periods of time, including reading. However, as of today, I'm in pre-production with a script I wrote a few weeks ago based on two characters talking over Skype during the lockdown. In a couple of hours, I'll be having the first Zoom meeting script read-through with my actors and planning the logistical nightmare of filming and directing a short film remotely, so wish me luck. But joking aside, it's great to have something writing-related to focus on. I've also continued to return to one of my other passions, music, and I've put out another performance recorded in multiple parts with my friend and collaborator George Odom. Again, it's been creative but fun challenge to assemble live versions of some of our own songs, filming each section as we go, so that I can then edit together the constituent parts to give the illusion that George and I are playing together, which unfortunately just isn't possible over the internet. Anyway, I'll pop a link to that in the show notes if you're interested, and you can look out for another video soon where we'll be playing an ELO classic. Either way, being productive and staying creative, writing related or not, has definitely helped me to feel more positive and motivated. But what about you? I want to hear what you're up to, so get in touch by tweeting me at JU Podcast, emailing wayne@waynekellywrites.com, or dropping me a line on the FB page, as I'd love to hear from you. Also, don't forget to join the email mailing list at joinedupwriting.co.uk to get free stuff and be the first to find out about upcoming shows and events. Right, let's get to today's interview with Laura Zigman. Laura is the author of Animal Husbandry, which was made into the film Someone Like You, starring Hugh Jackman, Dating Big Bird, Her, and Piece of Work. She's been a contributor to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Huffington Post, and a ghostwriter, and she's produced a popular online series of animated videos called Annoying Conversations, which we mentioned during our chat. She lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and her latest book, Separation Anxiety, is out right now. So here's our Skype chat recorded just a few days ago. Okay, Laura, thanks a million for joining me on Joined Up Writing. I really appreciate it. So why don't you, just to start us off, why don't you just tell everybody whereabouts in the world you're speaking from and give us a sense of how things are going, considering what's going on?
Sure. I'm in Cambridge, Mass., which is right in Harvard Square. And my book tour had started in early March. And so I was lucky enough to get out of Cambridge and go to New York and DC and a bunch of other cities. And within about 2 weeks of that, mid-March, everything got canceled. So I've been home in Harvard Square in my house, my apartment, with my husband and my 19-year-old son, who's been doing a gap year anyway, and our dog. And so we're just, we're here for the duration.
You're holding up.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's, for all the people that are essential workers and are going out into the world every day, we feel very lucky that we're able to be home. But it's, it has its own lesser challenges. So
Yeah,
no
I know exactly where you're coming from. A lot of
yeah.
us that are able to work from home and stuff are quite
Right.
fortunate, but
Yeah.
I know exactly what you're saying. All right, well, let's change the subject slightly. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your latest book, Separation Anxiety?
Sure. So this is my fifth novel, and I think it's apropos of your podcast that it took me 14 years between my last novel, which was published in 2006. So just a little background: my first novel was called Animal Husbandry, and it was published in the UK, but it was published the end of the 1990s, and it was one of the first books that later became part of a genre called chick lit. But when I wrote it, it wasn't chick lit. It was just a novel. And Animal Husbandry was published in a lot of countries, and it was made into a movie. And then I wrote three more novels, and I kind of had this sense, as most people do, I think, that once you achieve a certain level in your career, you're just, you've achieved it, and you just keep going. And that's not at all what happens. Success, and I'm using quotation marks, success is not a permanent state of being, nor is failure. I'm also using quotation marks there, or air quotes, whatever. But, what happened was in 2006, my fourth novel was published. It didn't do very well. And I got discouraged. I had a new agent who sort of told me maybe I should stop writing fiction for a while. Which was a really hard thing to hear and sort of a weird thing to hear from your agent.
Yeah.
Maybe someone else would have said, really? Maybe I need a new agent. But at the time, I was so demoralized that I thought, she's right, I'll just stop writing fiction. And I really stopped. And I stopped. And then a series of big life things happened to me. I got sick. My parents got sick. A lot of stuff happened. And I ended up feeling very uncreative. I wasn't able to really generate my own creative ideas, so I turned to ghostwriting. So in the years that I was ghostwriting, I would occasionally do some writing on the side of my own, but nothing, I just could not fathom starting another novel. So to make a very long story short, in 2015, I decided it was time to try again. I don't really know why I decided, but I just did. And through a series of baby steps, I was able to start this novel called Separation Anxiety. And the book is about a woman who's 50 and who's in that time of midlife where everything seems to be about loss and sadness. She's lost her parents. She's lost her career. She was a very successful children's book writer. Her son, who she was very close to, is now a teenager. He doesn't really talk to her. And her marriage is really failing. They would split up, but they can't afford to live separately. So they're sort of living together, even though they're kind of separated. And her best friend is dying. So I remember when I first showed a first chunk of pages to a friend of mine, he was like, "Does it get funny?" It was so grim. And I was like, yeah, it gets funny. But I felt very committed to not sugarcoating this particular time of life, which for me happened in my 40s and my early 50s. But for other people, they can experience loss in their 20s and 30s. It's not relegated necessarily to age, but having middle age just exacerbates everything. So it's a comic, sad novel. It's a mixture. And it really is about this family. It's about a 6-week time frame. And basically they're broke and they have to come up with the Montessori tuition. And in order to come up with the Montessori tuition, they end up taking in a group of people puppets who are going to come to the school and do like a 2-week unit. And they move in to the house and they get a deferment on their tuition. And that kind of starts everything going. It's a very short time frame.
Sure. Well, I know it's already garnered some great early comments as well before it comes out. So, and it sounds like it's funny as well. So it's good. It's good to hear that you've got things back on track. But we'll go into more about that long gestation period and everything else. But so for a start, let's just go back all the way back. Let's go to tell us about when you first started writing, or you started to think that you had a passion and a talent for writing.
I think for me, it started in junior high school and high school. It was really the only thing. I was always good in school, but, math at a certain age it was clear that I was terrible at math. And
you and me both.
I loved English, right? And I loved English. I loved reading and I loved writing. And so I had some, I did well in those things in college. I majored in English and that kind of thing. And after college, it was the 80s when I graduated in 1985, and there were no jobs, and my parents were always worried that what was I going to do with my English degree? Was I going to work for an insurance company and write the brochures? And I didn't come from a family that, understandably so, they had been raised in the Depression, and they didn't, they weren't the kind of people who would say, hey, take some time and write your novel. I was like, I always I've been working, I was a waitress since I was 14 or 15. So I always had a job. And when I finished college, I ended up going to the Radcliffe Publishing course, which was a 6-week summer program at Harvard. And it taught you about book publishing and magazine publishing. And it was a great course, and lots of really interesting people, some of whom I'm still friends with. And at the end of the 6 weeks, we all just assumed, I don't know if you ever watched the Mary Tyler Moore Show, but at the end of the very end of the whole series, there's a scene in the newsroom where they all hug, and then the telephone rings, and then they all move together over to the desk where the telephone is. Yeah. And that's what we thought. We're all going to stay in Boston and work for Little Brown, for a publisher. And of course, there weren't 12 jobs for us. So they ended up moving to New York, and I followed. And I ended up working for Random House for 10 years. I was a book publicist. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't initially what I wanted to do. I thought I wanted to work in editorial, but there were no jobs in editorial at the time. So I was a publicist, and that's what I did for 10 years. And I worked at Knopf at my last 3 years in New York. And it was a really grueling job. I made great friends, many of whom I'm still very good friends with now. But the job was very exhausting. And I thought I would have time to write in my spare time, but I was always trying to, find time, and I didn't have the energy. And so I would really write once a year. In the summers, I would go away for a week or two and use my vacation. And then what happened after I was in New York for 5 years, and then I applied to graduate school, and I left New York to go to a graduate program in Boston, which is where I'm from. And I got a teaching fellowship. It was a 1-year master's program. All I had to do was show up. And right before I left New York, I fell in love with somebody that I worked with. And we had this amazing romance, and I moved to Cambridge, and he came all summer back and forth. And we had this amazing, sort of movie-like relationship. And I started classes at my master's program in the fall, and I got to campus, and I had my first 2 or 3 days, and I instantly knew I hated it. It just wasn't for me. Right. And I remember calling all of my friends in New York, because you had to call them back then. Yeah. And I told them how I said, I don't like this. It's not for me. And they said, you know what? Why don't you give it some time? And I was like, okay. And they said, yeah, give it a semester. I was like, I'm giving it till Thursday. So I ended up dropping out after a few days, and I moved back to New York and got my old job back, where my boyfriend was, except that he apparently was no longer my boyfriend. He dumped me. Oh, dear. And that became the plot line for Animal Husbandry, which, was about a woman who gets dumped by studying, who tries to figure out male behavior by studying animal behavior. Because when I moved back to New York and got dumped, I ended up moving in. I had no place to live. I ended up moving in with somebody else from the office who is this incredible womanizer. And I moved in with him, and it was like living in the belly of the beast. So that was sort of a magical
You got to see it, the monster close up. Yeah,
absolutely. And it sort of felt like this whole plot line was just developing in real time, in real life. And but it took 5.5 years after that to write the novel. And I did get lucky that first time. There weren't a lot of books like it out at the time. Like I said, chick lit didn't exist, and it wasn't even a genre, and nobody. And so for when Animal Husbandry came out, it really was kind of like a little bit of a moment. And then I was able to quit my day job, which by that point I had moved to Washington, D.C., and I was living there. And I had a job. I had a job at the Smithsonian, which was very 9 to 5, and I was able to quit that job. And I wrote my second novel, and then I wrote my third, and like that. And I sort of thought I was off to the races. Yeah.
Sure. So with that first book, Animal Husbandry, when that was coming out, so give us a sense of you. I mean, I know you kind of, you're being a bit self-effacing there and saying that you were very lucky and all that kind of thing, but obviously the book had to be decent in the first place. But what was the path to publication there? So once you'd written the book, were you nervous about getting it out there? Obviously you were working as a book publicist, so you'd kind of been the other side of the fence sort of thing. You'd seen the other side of it. So how did you feel about when you first started to tentatively or not put the book out there and say, well, I've written this sort of thing?
That's a really good question. I did know the business. had been working in it for a decade. And so I had a sense of what was out there in terms of material and content. And I had a feeling that I was never overconfident, but I did have a feeling that this was something that was sort of new. Like, one of the reasons some of us write our particular novels is because there's none out there that sort of solved the problem. So when I was dumped, I was looking for something that would be about what I was going through, and there wasn't anything. I mean, there was like Madame Bovary, but that didn't really help me at the time. But so I sort of had a feeling that this was a newish thing. And you have to remember that, Helen Fielding's Bridget Jones's Diary was already out in the UK, but it wasn't like it is now.
Sure.
I had no idea that it was out. And a lot of books ended up coming out within a few months of each other. For instance, I know her book came out in England, mine came out here, hers then came out here. Jane Green was writing. I mean, there were a lot of sort of a collective consciousness in the UK and in the States of women who were waiting to get married, who were single in the city and working and having relationships and a kind of a life that really hadn't been documented before in fiction. And so I felt like I had something. I sort of felt like I had something, and I knew different agents, and I decided at the last minute, I thought I was going to go with one very established one. And at the very last minute, I changed my mind and I sent it to somebody who was quite young at the time, who worked for a big agent. His name was Bill Clegg, who is now a very well-known writer and agent. And I was one of his early clients, and he was terrific. And I wanted somebody who was sort of young and really hungry, and that's what he was. And we had a great run together for a while. When he was my agent. So I didn't send to a whole bunch. I just sent to him. Yeah. And I figured I would send, see what he said and then go from there.
And it worked out, obviously, fabulously.
Yeah, it did work out.
So when it actually made its way into the world and you started to get, great notices for it, and then, you had this success, tell me about that. How did that feel after working in a job for such a long time that you didn't particularly like and everything else, and kind of beavering away in the background? Tell me about that experience.
It's so funny. It's, it felt great. It felt really weird, and it felt really great. Like, all of a sudden, I had been working since I was 14. I had always had a job. And so suddenly I had this beautiful apartment in Washington, with a bedroom and a little office. I had come from a studio in New York, and I was able to work at home and meet friends for lunch. It was just like a weird thing. I had money for the first time in my life. I was able to buy like a vacuum cleaner and furniture and, get people gifts. Like, it was just sort of a charmed few years. It felt like very surreal to have gone from always really being stressed about, having a job, keeping a job, wanting to quit, but knowing I couldn't, had to support myself, to suddenly feeling like, the book had sold in maybe 20 countries. And it was back in the day when, the money was really good back then for things. And the film was on track. It was fast-tracked, in fact, to be made. And it was made. And we all know how things in Hollywood normally work.
Yeah.
Usually nothing happens.
You get an option and then that's it.
Yeah, exactly. So, which, of course, we're grateful for that, too. So this was just really surreal that everything happened, and it happened in sort of a big way. And, it just felt really good. It also sets up a whole different thing. Like, when you're writing in obscurity, as I was for, all those years that I was writing Animal Husbandry, for at least 5.5 years, there's a freedom in it where no one's looking at it. You can sort of do what you want. There's no fear in the sense of like, you don't have any expectations. And then once you are established to whatever degree you are established, then, there's the second novel syndrome. Like, is your second one going to be as good? Then you get all the judgment. Then you get you get the writer's block, the fear, all that kind of stuff. So there is an interesting movement toward that kind of anxiety that starts to happen. But for the most part, I have to say it was great. And I was able to write a second novel and do my third and even the fourth.
Yeah.
In relatively, a couple of years in between each one.
So when you mentioned the film there, so which became Someone Like Me, I think, wasn't it? And
Yeah.
so again, do you remember when you got the initial call that, well, first that it was being optioned, and then when you actually discovered that it was actually in production and it was going ahead, and you've got people like Hugh Jackman and people like that involved? Tell us about that?
It's just, it's crazy. It's like you're getting these phone calls from Hollywood, and they're flying you out just to. I remember I was represented by CAA, and there was a very well known. He sold books. He was the guy that sold the books to the studios, and his name was actually Bob Bookman.
Perfect.
And he'd been around forever, and they flew me out, and I stayed in this great hotel, and he picked me up in his Porsche, and he took me to the opera. It was really crazy. And then I met with the producer. Once it sold, they flew me out again, and it sold to Linda Obst, who had made Sleepless in Seattle and Flashdance, and I went to her bungalow on the Fox lot, and we actually drove from her office bungalow to the commissary, which I swear to God was like 25 yards away. We actually. And you would have these conversations with people, or these moments in Hollywood where you would be just like looking around for the candid camera. Like it was so cliche. Like you couldn't believe they were actually having the conversations that you see on TV. They're real. Like they're just there. It's ridiculous. But people were really, they were really nice. I mean, of course, a lot of them were full of shit, but who cares? It was a lot of fun.
I've been to LA. Yeah, I understand.
Yeah. And a lot of people were like, especially when the movie came out. I mean, when it was cast, Jennifer Aniston was supposed to be in it. Then she dropped out. Then Julia Roberts wanted to be in it. Then they couldn't get her, or they couldn't get to the timing, or she didn't like the script or whatever. And then it turned out to be Hugh Jackman, who really was not famous at the time. He'd just done Swordfish, I think. Mm-hmm. And he wasn't that well known. And I mean, Ashley Judd was, whatever. And so the cast was kind of like, okay. Anyway, I mean, I thought they were great. I mean, was it a great movie? No. And people afterwards were like, oh, how did this is one of my favorite things that happened. People would say to me, how did your movie do?
Yeah.
And I'd be as if to shame me that it was only open, because it came out right. My movie was on the same time track as Bridget Jones's Diary. And so they were both like, being in development at the same time, being shot at the same time, and they were released within a couple of weeks of each other. And of course, her movie did great. Mine didn't do so well. But who cares, right? But I have people would ask me, like, how'd your movie do?
To which I would have replied, how did your movie do?
You know what, Wayne? That is exactly the response I always gave. And it was the one time in my life, before or after, I've never been able to do it, where I had the exact perfect response in the moment. How did my movie do? How did your movie do, dude? So I always found it funny that people always like to find a way to sort of shame you if you don't do well. Like, did your book hit the list? Did this? Yeah. It's like, no, So, but aside from that, it was wild. I mean, there was a premiere, and a lot of these things, like the premiere in New York was really like, I don't even remember if I had shoes on, because my parents came, my husband's mother was there, my sister, like there were so many people coming that we had to sort of make sure they were having a good time, that I was like, do I have lipstick on my teeth? I barely got dressed. Yeah. But it was just a really...
what was the experience like actually seeing it, something that's taken from your idea, it's come out of your head, and then you see it up on the big screen? What was that like?
It was really... I keep using the word surreal, but it was really surreal because we had, I had my son right on the same day, July 8th, 2000. And that was when the film started shooting. It's called The Commencement of Principal Photography. Mm-hmm. And anyone who has a film being made or optioned knows that phrase is the magic phrase, commencement of principal photography. That means they're cutting you the check. Yeah. So the movie could never get released, but you're getting your money. So they had called to say, it's starting July 8th is our first film day. And then they started to call, because back then, there was email and calling, but they go, do you want to come visit? Do you want to come visit the set? You want to come visit the set in New York? They were shooting in New York. And I just had a baby. I felt really fat. I didn't want to go. And to make a long story short, we finally went. It was my husband, the baby, his mother, his daughter from his first marriage was in from Denver. I think you get the picture. We drove from DC to New York. We had a huge fight in the car where my husband, we had both used to live in New York, but we'd never been to Tribeca. This was a long time ago.
Yeah.
And he actually accused me of withholding directions as if I wanted to be in the car any longer with him. Anyway, we got there and we went into this huge building where they were shooting in Tribeca, and they were actually shooting a scene with Ashley Judd and Hugh Jackman. They were sitting on the couch, and they were actually using probably the only piece of dialogue that I had written in the book that was in the movie.
Wow.
And it was really cool. And Hugh Jackman was so nice. He had just adopted a little boy, and he was really into my son Benji, and he was super friendly. And Greg Kinnear was really nice. Like, everyone was really nice, and it was really fun to visit. And then the premiere was just wild. I remember a lot of the premiere was spent trying to keep my father away from the other parents, like Naomi Judd. Is that the mother of Ashley Judd? Whoever Ashley Judd's mother is. And Marissa Tomei's parents were there because she's from New York. She lives in New York. And so he kept turning around because they have assigned seats in the theater. And he kept turning around like, hey, I'm a dad, you're a dad. At the time, I was so embarrassed, And I was like,
and he was just so proud, Yeah,
he was really, but it was fun. I mean, it was really special. But it was fun.
It sounds fantastic. Yeah. So as you say, so you've got, not only have you got this really successful debut, it also gets optioned and it gets made into a film. And then you move on to, that difficult second album, the second book or whatever. So you kind of alluded to it, but you did feel that pressure, presumably because you'd been working the whole time you'd been doing the debut, and so you're out of sight. So the first time you sort of sit down and you start working on had you started working on the second novel presumably before Animal Husbandry came out?
Yes. So by the time the book came out, it was kind of a long lag time between the time I sold it, and they wanted to do this whole thing, or like they made a really long lead time to it. And so it came out, I think, in January of 98. And a few months later, I went off to write my second novel, which was called Dating Big Bird, which was about a woman who tries to figure out how to have a baby when she's not married. And I wrote that over that following summer, the summer of 1998, and that was finished by the fall. And so my second novel was already written by the time the movie was being shot. So, but by the time I wrote the second novel, there were the film agent was waiting for it, and this was waiting for it. And then you have a whole team now, and everyone's looking at it and judging it, where it's just a whole different experience. And then that came out, and then I started on the third one. And by that point, by this time the second book came out, which was about getting pregnant, I was already pregnant. So it was a really weird,
writing your life. Yeah,
it was weird. And then Her came out from Knopf, which was a really interesting experience because I had worked at Knopf in New York. Yeah. So my fourth novel, I switched publishers, and I ended up being published by the team of people I had worked with.
How was that?
Sunny Mehta, and my boss was my publicist. It was so delicious, It was great. My editor was Robin Desser, who I had worked with for a long time. It was great. They did a phenomenal jacket, and Knopf was great, and the book did okay. It did not great, and then then a lot of stuff changed right after that. That was 2002, and then I had to split with my agent, who was, like I said, Bill Clegg. It's very well publicized, but he had a drug issue. He's since written two or three really incredible memoirs about his addiction, and two novels. He's very, very talented. Mm-hmm. But he kind of left the business for a while, and I found a new person. And that's when I wrote Piece of Work. And that was about a mother going back to work after having a child and sort of trying to pick up her career where she'd left off. Mm-hmm. And that was optioned very with kind of a lot of fanfare for Tom Hanks and Nia Vardalos, who'd done My Big Fat Greek Wedding. Mm-hmm. And nothing happened. It just didn't happen.
Which is often the case, isn't it?
Which is so often the case.
And usually what happens.
Really good friends, and over the years, it just nothing happened. And and like that. And that's after that. That's when a lot of personal stuff started to happen for me, and that's when I stopped writing fiction.
Yeah, and as you say, you kind of talked about it up at the top of the show, but so you didn't have a great experience with that, and then you had all this personal stuff that kicks off in your life as well, and so you spent some time ghostwriting. And I mean, I've spoken to people that have done ghostwriting before, so I understand it different. It sounds, your experience with it sounds slightly different, because usually what happens is people kind of start off ghostwriting before they've even got their own novel out into the world, and they've got that frustration of being, the person behind they're hidden out of sight. But for you, it sounds like you deliberately sought that kind of hiding place. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, that's a really good way to say it. I had breast cancer, and it was caught very early, but I had a very extensive kind of surgery. Mm-hmm. And it was the end of 2006, early 2007. So it was really before social media. I mean, there was MySpace. Okay. There was no there was no Facebook, there was no Instagram. Right. And so there was like Food Network, there was TV. Yeah. There was still TV. And so I was in bed recovering for just months, and I watched a lot of TV. And one of the shows I watched was about a television matchmaker in Buffalo, New York, which is a really gritty blue-collar town in upstate New York. And it was a really charming, reality show. And I think I still had a blog, and I blogged about how much I liked the show. But a month later, her producer contacted me and said, Patty wants to write a book. Are you interested? And I was like, of course. I had no idea how to do it. Yeah. And that was my first project. And then I did some other interesting projects. And one of my favorite ones was I worked with Eddie Izzard on his memoir. And, that I had the good fortune of working with several really interesting people whose stories I felt really honored to tell. And he was like a very extraordinary person to work with. Hard to chase down because he travels so much, but still wonderful, really wonderful person.
And how did you find the experience from a point of view, because essentially you're having to find the voice. It's not your voice, is it? You're finding the voice of this other person. You're trying to reflect them as accurately as possible, so that if someone picks up the book and they read it, as far as they're concerned, it's Eddie Izzard or it's whoever you happen to be writing. So how did you adapt to that? How did you find that?
That's a good question too. I think it's really what we do as writers, fiction writers especially, is when you're writing a character, one character is a different voice from another character. And, part of ghostwriting, I always say that for ghostwriting, like the writing is the easy part. It's really, you're really absorbing, you're listening to them, you're trying to extract their deepest stories from them. You're trying to get out of them the things that they don't tell the magazines, and you have to establish trust, and you have to sort of be a little bit like a shrink. And so by the time you sit down to write, you're like, oh, this is easy. But, for someone like Eddie, what was so fascinating, I mean, he's so distinctive. And what would happen was I would get, you tape record your conversations, or sometimes we met in person. A lot of times it was in Skype. We were doing Skype. And I would have the conversations transcribed by a transcriptionist. And I would get the pages back, and oh my God, it was all over the place. He was talking about this, and he was talking about that, because that's how
his brain's wired,
and that's why he's so funny. And so I thought, geez, how am I going to be true to his voice? And so what I decided to do was I ended up using footnotes throughout the book, so that he would start telling a story, and then there would be a footnote when he digressed. Yeah. And so the digressions, I think in the audiobook were hysterically funny, because he really does go off on these tangents, and the tangents, especially in the audiobook, are so funny. Yeah. And then he comes back. But I felt like there had to be a device for that, because you just
because that's how his stand-up is, isn't it? Yeah, that's the whole kind of premise of what he does. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So that was, that's like an extreme case where you have someone who's just so extraordinarily different. But most of the time you're just really, you're listening to their language, how they talk, something that they would absolutely not say. And you just get into that rhythm of it. And I still do it. I really do love it. It's hard. But at the time to get back to your question, I found a certain relief in it. It was like I was so relieved not to have to feel like I was failing at my own work. I just was exhausted by life, And I found this was like a job. I could approach it like a job. I had skills that allowed me to earn a living. And somehow taking on someone else's voice was just a relief, even though, of course, it just, pushed me further away from my own work, which was definitely frustrating. In the back of my head, I was very frustrated. I kind of always felt like, what happened to my career? Like, what happened?
Sure.
I was able to write, and now I don't, and took a long time.
What was I mean, I should imagine there was lots and lots and lots of little things over a long period of time with that kind of break between a piece of work and then separation anxiety. But what do you think was kind of the main turning point? What was the point at which you thought, right, no, this is it now, I'm going to actually sit down and do something for myself? Do you remember that?
It's such a good question, too. It's hard to know because, like you said, there were all these little moments. I mean, part of it was that all my friends, I was on Twitter, a lot of my friends were writers. They were publishing their books, and I was cheerleading and retweeting and posting. And because I'm always so happy for my friends, I really am. And I was always like, yeah, but what about, like, why can't I? And the great thing was I had all these friends who really, really kept after me. They were always sort of saying, you should try again, try again. And I think people often wonder if they should say that to people who aren't writing. Does it make them feel worse? It was actually didn't make me feel worse. It actually made me feel better that people cared and that they wanted me to. And I had a lot of people from different parts of my life, people I saw every day, friends that I knew purely online, people I had known in when I was a publicist used to write to me occasionally and just be like, are you ever going to write another one? I just love your, like that.
Yeah.
And there was a point, I think, where I just was so frustrated. Like, I knew I had one more book in me. I just felt like I have to write one more. And I did really feel like, as with my other work, I felt like I was now going through something that so many people were facing. You hit 50, especially as a female, you're like super invisible, which is both a relief and sad.
Sure.
I'd lost both my parents. I had dealt with, what it's like to watch two people die from, really fast cancers.
Yeah.
I had like just so much stuff. You have the marriage stuff, you have the kids stuff, you have the private school stuff, you have all this stuff. And even if all of it isn't in the book isn't true, it's all based in what, the stuff I was really going through at the time. And I felt like a lot of people were, go through that. And I just wanted to tell that story. And to go back a little, in the years that I wasn't writing books, I kept always trying. And this is why I feel like baby steps are super, super important for people who are blocked or who are just in between projects and feel discouraged. It's like all the years that I wasn't writing novels, like in 2011, it was about a year after my mother died, I discovered this online platform called Extra Normal. And it was these animated characters, and you could write a script, and the animated characters would then speak your words, and it would make it into like a little video. And I started to make these. I called them annoying conversations. And I would make these, and I made about 75 of them, and I would post them on Twitter. And a lot of them got picked up by the Huffington Post and AOL's homepage, and a lot of different places started to pick them up because the topics were so, they were very funny topics. And I was so excited because I was like, oh, this is so great. Like, I would sit down in the morning. I'd had an annoying conversation the night before, like either my husband and I had an argument, or we had been with another couple and we had a weird evening or whatever. So I would write a little script in the morning and I would post it. And it was like no writer's block because I didn't feel like writing.
Yeah.
It felt like
you were
fun.
tricking yourself. Yeah.
I was totally tricking myself. And so I ended up writing these, but then I felt like a failure because like I couldn't monetize them. Like I couldn't get a deal.
Right,
So I stopped, and the platform went out of business. And so I made 75. They're still on YouTube. You can still find them. And then a year later, I wrote a script from scratch. And my agents at the time really loved it, and it didn't sell. And a few years later in 2015, I decided that I was going to try again. And I rented a shrink's office, a therapist's office in Harvard Square by the hour. I needed office space, but I really couldn't afford it. So I went on Craigslist, and I discovered you could rent therapist's office by the hour. So I rented for a few months. I know it sounds really creepy. Yeah. It sort of was, just a little creepy. But I rented it for like a couple months, Sundays and Mondays. And I would go there knowing that I wasn't going to ghostwrite on those days. I would just sit there. And some days I was able to write and other days I didn't, but it didn't matter. I sort of felt like I'm carving out this time.
Sort of made an appointment to write almost.
Exactly. And I was able to use that screenplay that I'd written. Mm-hmm. I took pieces of it. I knew that just transforming the screenplay as it was into a novel wouldn't work.
Yeah.
But I was able to take a few scenes and a few characters, and seed the novel, and also a few of the little bits of pieces of those 75 videos. A few things ended up also in the novel. And so I always think, like, in all that time when I felt like I was doing nothing and I was wasting my time and I couldn't monetize these videos and what a loser I was, it really was like all that stuff helped me when I finally was ready. It really seeded this book. And so never think what you're doing is wasted.
Nothing is wasted.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in between that time, obviously, when you sat down and you started, or when you started writing separation anxiety, or when you realized that that's what you were writing, did you find that your process had changed at all? Had you learned stuff from doing the ghostwriting and different things? Did you in the way that you approach this book, is it different to the way you approached a piece of work, for example?
Yeah, I think I did. In a way, I had been out of the game for so long that I just, I had no confidence. I just sort of felt like I never thought I'd finish it. I never, so I would work on it, and then I'd get interrupted by the ghostwriter, and then I'd come back to it. I'd hate it. I started working on a memoir. I went to a residency at Yaddo, which is one of those places where you go away for a month. It's bliss. And I just couldn't sort of get footing on either project, even though I worked on both. And finally, I finally started to hit my stride. And I used something I had read by Elizabeth Strout, Olive Kittredge, and she's an amazing writer. And she said that the way she writes these novels, like Olive Kittredge and all of her other ones, is she just writes scenes. Mm-hmm. She just writes scenes. And then she figures out kind of how to put them together. So she has these characters. And instead of trying to figure out this huge plot, she just writes these scenes. So it's almost like these interconnected stories, but they're not, they are novels.
Yeah, sure.
But there was a sort of a freedom in that. There would be a point when I had all my characters and I kind of had the setup. They're broke. They want to get divorced, but they can't afford to. This is happening. But like, now what? There's always that horrible moment when you write fiction, as now what? You have to the plot.
Yeah.
And I found that if I just stopped thinking in terms of the plot, and I just really, for the first time ever, was like, who are these people? What would they really do? Like, what would they do? What would Judy do when she catches her husband, smoking pot? What would he do when he catches her wearing the dog in a baby sling? Like, what would he actually say to her? Like, not some, sitcom kind of chit chat banter, but like, what would they say?
Yeah.
It's real. Like, and I was just listening to Judd Apatow. He does this masterclass thing. It's like a online class. And he said something so interesting that I listened to the other day. He said, when you're doing comedy, it's the setup and the whole, everything should really be able to also work as a non-comedy.
Yeah.
So what he said when he wrote 40-Year-Old Virgin, he said they could have done it in a real slapstick way, but he said they really approached it like he was a real person who was 40 and full of shame.
Yeah.
And that's what I did that's what it really, how I worked when I worked on this. It was like, I wanted it to be funny, but unlike all my other books were like, they had to be funny.
Yeah.
This was like, no, this is real. And then it's also funny. And the funny was sort of secondary to me. I wanted it to be like really true to, and not sugarcoat, the sadness. And I knew that was a risk, because people want to be, you can run the risk of writing too much grim,
sure,
sad, and that no one wants to read that. So it is a fine line.
But from the sounds of it so far, you've managed to pull that off, and that's what's, that's going to kind of be what makes this novel different and stand out.
Yeah.
So, if you were sitting down to write a new novel tomorrow, how would you how would you approach it? Do you plan? Do you literally, as you say, you just think an idea comes with a couple of characters and you start writing a scene? How do you approach it?
Another great question. I think I've already started thinking, and I think it's going to involve a ghostwriter.
Where do you get these ideas from?
And I think it's the bigger theme is really invisibility. Invisibility of a certain age and invisibility just, in whatever facet of life you feel invisible. And I think that kind of theme, plus some of the funny, I just worked with somebody, a giant celebrity, and I mean, it's sort of hilarious. So there's like pieces of that, but again, that's not what interests me anymore. The quick jokes, that doesn't interest me anymore the way it used to. I want to delve deeper into like what it really means. So I'm just starting. I think you have to start with the character.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, again, if you start with the character or the characters and the relationships, you will find the plot. But there's this intense fear, like anxiety. You're like, well, what's it about? What's it about? What's going to happen? What's going to happen? And I don't know what's going to happen. Like even with separation anxiety, I had all of everything sort of set up and I had no idea where it was going to go. And I don't know if we have time, but it was a great story how I figured out. I went to this life coach that I go to. And to say she's a life coach is just a waste because she's one of the most brilliant sort of shrink type people.
Yeah.
And I went to her and I told her, I said, I'm totally stuck. I said, I'm, gotten to this point in the novel, and she made me tell her all about it, which was like just gross. I felt like, I don't want to talk about it. I hate it so much. And I told her the whole thing. And I said, this happens, this happens. And then the people puppets, these people who dress up as puppets, move in. And I said, and I don't know why they're there. I just have no idea. It's like everything's set, but I have no idea where it's going. And she sort of sat there and she's like, oh my God, I can't believe you asked me this question. She said, I just told my husband this story the night before. And at the time I didn't know why I was telling him. And now I understand it's because I had to tell you today. And she went on to tell me she grew up in Princeton, New Jersey, and her mother was a shrink, like a couple's, like a couple's person, a therapist. And on one Saturday afternoon, her mother said to my person and her brother, go outside for the afternoon. I have an emergency session coming over. And this couple came over, and they came over. They were in the process of splitting up, but they came over because they had this emergency. And the emergency was that they had somebody living in their attic. They had a writer friend. He was a writer, the guy.
Yeah.
And they had taken in this old friend, and he was living in their attic. And at first it was like he was there, and then he was supposed to leave. And then after like the first month or two, the guy wouldn't leave. He just refused to leave. He was like, I'm not leaving. And he stayed. And finally, like after a couple of months, on that particular day, he came downstairs and told the couple, okay, I'm leaving now. And the reason he was leaving now was because he had finished his screenplay. And his screenplay was based on eavesdropping on them fighting and their just miserable marriage. And it turned out that his screenplay was Shoot the Moon, which starred Albert Finney. So it was this great story about like how this person had moved in and was just like eavesdropping and collecting all of their stuff. And even though that's not what happens in my novel, I was like, oh my God, the people puppets are much more benign, but it sort of, goes to show you that there's go talk to anyone who can possibly help you get unstuck.
Yeah. And I think sometimes even if the person that you're talking to knows nothing about your novel, nothing about your story, nothing about writing even, sometimes just saying it out loud to somebody else just unblocks something. And I think even you almost answer your own question sometimes as you're saying it. Actually, no, I know what it is now. It's this, and that's going to happen or whatever. So I definitely think there is something in that.
And like you just said, sometimes when you ask a non-writer, it's better because they just answer you like a person. They'll be like, wait, why does the guy, why does he, like they just answer you like a normal person. They're like, that's weird. That wouldn't happen. You're like, you're right. That wouldn't happen.
Absolutely.
So,
Definitely. So what would you say, in your long and esteemed career, what's been the most helpful piece of creative or inspirational advice that you've been given, would you say?
Gee, another great question. I think there's something in the Annie Lamott bird by bird philosophy, which is just so simple, which is just like bird by bird, page by page, line by line. You just have to, keep the faith that you can get there. There's that great quotation. I think that's always been for me what it's about, which is, I think E.L. Doctor said it, which is that you can, writing a novel is like driving cross country in a blizzard. You can only see 2 or 3 feet ahead of you, but you can get there. And that's what writing for me is like. There are times I can't see more than a page ahead of me or a paragraph. Like I'm just stuck, and you just have to trust that like you can keep going. Even with that really limited visibility, you can push forward. And then there'll be times when, the sky clears and you have that vista and you can see the plot and you can see everything. But then you go right back in and it's a blizzard. Where am I? What am I? And you just have to, that for me has always been a really, really helpful metaphor. That
just trust in the process.
Yeah.
And if you were starting out again tomorrow, fresh as a new writer, what if anything would you do differently? Or what would you go back and tell your younger self, knowing what you know now?
Wow, I think I would just say, trust your instincts and trust your ability to figure things out. Like even if it takes a while, you'll have dry spells and dry years, but it's in you. And just don't compare yourself to other people. Don't now we're in such a competitive environment where you see people's progress every day. People post their word counts and their book deals and their writing deal, and it doesn't matter. There's room for everyone. Like just because someone else got something doesn't mean you won't get it. And it's all about just being true to a story. Like what do you want to say? What story do you want to tell? And you have to be really, really interested in the story you're telling, because it takes a really long time to write a novel, it takes a lot of work. You can write one really quickly, but you have to really spend a lot of time rewriting it, and it better be something. That's why a lot of people often think like, what's going to sell? Nobody knows what's going to sell. Nobody knows what's going to be successful, and so it has to be something that you're fascinated by or that is really meaningful to you, because it has to sustain you for a long time.
For a long period of time. Well, it's a great place to sort of wind things up. So just before we go, just tell us, give us, you've kind of hinted at it, but give us a sense of what's up next and also where people can find out more about you online.
Sure. I think my next novel is going to be called The Ghostwriter, and I'm going to start working on that soon. And I have a website, www.laurazigman.com. I'm on Instagram, Laura Zigman, Twitter, Laura Zigman. I wrote a piece for Modern Love for the New York Times back in November, which I really loved. That's on my website, or you can just Google that. So I'm around.
That's brilliant. Well, I'll put all those notes in the show notes, and obviously good luck with the book that's coming out. Well, I think it comes out here. I think by the time this podcast comes out, which is next week, so it'll be out. I think it comes out on this Thursday, doesn't it? I think.
Yes.
So good luck with that. I'm sure it'll go fantastically. And it's been a pleasure to speak to you. Thanks a million, Laura.
Such a pleasure. Really nice to talk to you, Wayne. Thank you.
Joined up writing.
Okay, thanks again to Laura Zigman, and I'll put all of those links in the show notes over at joinedupwriting.co.uk. That's it for this week, but don't forget you can find the entire back catalogue of interviews on the website. That's over 100 now, not to mention all the little episodes as well. Make sure you subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, or wherever else you get your podcasts to have the podcasted downloaded automatically every week. Also remember to leave us a nice rating and review on Apple Podcast. It really does help people to find the show. Or even, just tell someone else about the show, or share it on your social media platform of choice. That would be great as well. So that's it for this week. So thanks for listening. I'm Wayne Kelly. Happy writing, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.